here with Ger Garland, Irish Whiskey Ambassador for the Midleton Distillery Collection. My name's Joe, I'm the Prestige Irish Whiskey Ambassador for Dillon Bass here in the north, and we're in the second fiddle in Belfast. So Ger, if you just want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your role for Irish Distillers in Midleton.
My career in whiskey began 21 years ago, which is hard to believe, and I started basically because I had an interest in the drinks industry and wanted to work in it. So what I did was I applied to all of the drinks companies within the Yellow Pages, which was a phone book, and only one replied, and I'm still working for them.
Yeah, there you go.
So I'm very happy with that.
And then what were you doing when you initially started with Irish Distillers?
Merchandising. So it was coming up to Christmas and I was literally filling shelves with bottles of whiskey. Essentially we had 4 different whiskies at the time. It was a market that was not as diverse or exciting as it is now. And if I'm perfectly honest, I didn't really know anything about whiskey bar the brands. And that's what's key about whiskey is the power that the brands have.
So I'd say between the difference of 21 years, the role and the whiskey scene has completely changed.
It's a different world. It really is. And if we look back 21 years ago, there really was only at the time 3 different producers of whiskey on the island, you know. And now we have over 40 distilleries, which is just absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And obviously you started off in a merchandising role, I suppose. Back then, like the idea of our role as an Irish Whiskey Ambassador, that kind of role probably didn't really exist at that point.
It didn't, and we had visitor centres that were very basic from the point of view of telling the story about how whiskey was made or its history. And I think fundamentally, internally as well, we didn't quite understand the richness of heritage and history that we possessed and that we were all custodians of. Mm-hmm. I became a sales rep, but I worked in every area of it. I worked in wholesale, I worked in hotels, I worked in supermarkets, I worked in pubs, and I loved the on-trade. I really particularly loved the pubs that are in Northern Ireland and all around the island of Ireland. It is some of the best places where you will meet the most interesting people, you'll have the most fun, and you meet the customers that consume our products as well.
Yeah, agreed. And did you develop a bit of a reputation as you know, someone who was passionate about whiskey, or?
I developed a reputation, all right, Joe.
Yeah.
So I developed a reputation as someone internally that was very curious about finding out more about our products. Probably this interest was piqued by my first encounter with people like Barry Crockett, our former master distiller, who I just knew as Barry, who worked in the distillery. I didn't realise his position.
He was the Barry.
He was the Barry.
Is there any particular parts about the role that you really enjoy? Like, I know obviously the events are a bit of a highlight for you.
Yeah, it's a bit cliche to say, but it really is meeting people and meeting the people that make our whiskies, that work for other whiskey companies. But also meeting consumers, and a lot of them have become friends, genuinely have become friends over years, and they are familiar faces sometimes in a crowd when you're a little bit nervous about, you know, and I still get nervous when I'm up public speaking, and it really helps that we have this large community that has grown over the last number of years in particular.
Yeah, and a lot of them are in it because they love it, so they're not there to catch you out necessarily, they're there to support you.
There's always one though, isn't
there?
There's always one to catch out. But luckily enough, I try and be true about what I'm saying and also true to myself. So I usually have the answer, hopefully, and if I can't find the answer, I'll ring someone up that has the answer. Maybe ring you up and you'll be able to tell me.
That's all you can do, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
And then you know, you talk about being caught out. Like, I know personally, like, things have gone wrong. There's been mishaps. Is there anything particularly in your career that stands out?
I think probably for me is the one mistake that I made was asking someone else to pour the whiskey for me, and I'll never make that mistake again. And they just basically poured it into whatever glass they felt because they were in a rush, and I'd a whole room of people totally confused, And
Everybody's got a different glass.
everyone's got a different glass, and luckily we discovered after the second whiskey, and literally we had to go back and we re-poured. It was a small enough group, but and that's one thing that is something now that I take care very carefully to do is I pour the whiskey if I'm doing the tasting, then I can be assured. I know it sounds like a very specific thing, but it can really mess you up if you get it wrong. But if you're drinking a whiskey, Joe, drink it out of whatever vessel you like to drink it out of. If it's your first time trying a whiskey, I'd recommend that you essentially approach it with the same fundamental rules of nosing it, having a look at it, see what it looks like in the glass, tasting it, and if you find it a bit overwhelming, add a few drops of water. If it's still a bit overwhelming on your palate, add a few more drops of water, and last but not least, add a bit of ice if that's what you want. But other than that, drink it whatever way you want. It's fun. It's meant to be an enjoyable
You kind of have to remind
drink.
yourself sometimes at the end of the day it is a drink just meant to be enjoyed and have a bit of fun with it.
Absolutely, and if you put too many rules on anything, it doesn't become fun anymore, and you're not going to appreciate it or enjoy it. I think there's a whiskey for everybody. So we're very lucky in the whiskies that Middleton Distillery produce, in that there is a wide variety of brands that appeal to a wide variety of people.
There's a whiskey for every person and there's a whiskey for every occasion.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there any particular experiences that have really stood out in your career that were particularly notable or something you were particularly proud of?
I've done amazing. Whiskey's brought me in two amazing places and got me in front of amazing people. I've stood in front of a group of politicians in the middle of a large European city and done an Irish whiskey tasting. Also, you meet celebrities. I've done some celebrity sports tastings for celebrity sports people. I've done tastings for pop stars, as well. And it's really interesting. I think the most intimidating group of people that you can get in front of are probably the people internally that you work with.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them would have big knowledge, but also they are, if you're in any way showing a bit of bravado and, a bit sure of yourself.
Take you down a peg.
Oh, they take you down big time. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say so. You obviously had an interest in whiskey when you started with
Yes.
the company. How did you find yourself getting into whiskey? I'm sure it's a question you get asked all the time, but people always want to know.
Yeah, I think I saw Dave McCabe, who was our former academy tutor, who now is our blender in Middleton Distillery. Dave did a whiskey tasting in Cork in 2014, 2015. I went to it and I was absolutely smitten. I said, I have to do this job. That's what I want to do with my career. So luckily enough, an opening came up essentially in a role where part of that would have been whiskey education.
Yeah.
And myself and 48 other people went
Wow.
for the job, and unbelievably I got the job, which was absolutely amazing. I'm doing the role now for a number of years, but at the time I left a wedding early where I was best man to go and study for a week in advance of the interview.
You were committed?
Oh, big time. Yeah, I definitely wanted this job more than anything else, and it's paid off. I think one thing that we're famous for in Ireland is producing fantastic world-class products, and one of those is whiskey. We invented it, we gave it its name. We have, the brands, I think, that are world beating.
It's interesting to think that so many people for a long time just associated whiskey with Scotland or maybe with bourbon or different other categories of whiskey, but it now seems like people are starting to kind of turn their eyes a little bit more towards Irish whiskey and just have a bit more of an interest in it.
Definitely. I mean, if you think of a product like Jameson, that really has been the bridgehead for Irish whiskey, because it's got Irish whiskey on back bars all over the world. But now I suppose the challenge is to create a premium Irish whiskey market outside of Ireland. And if you come into any of the pubs in Belfast or Newry or further afield around Northern Ireland, you'll see an amazing selection of Irish whiskey behind the bar. You're always going to find something familiar. You're going to find traditional Irish hospitality at its very best.
So obviously you work very, very closely with the trade. both the on-trade with different bars, but also with retail as well.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what a training session would look like to you?
Well, it depends on the type of outlet that you're going to talk to, the type of products, but generally you're looking at training people on a very basic level, because a lot of the people that we would get to talk to are new to the trade, and particularly over the last couple of years post-pandemic. So you're looking at what whiskey is, how it's made, and the brands, and how to upsell is the main thing as well. Like, how do you tell consumers why they should pay £7 instead of £5 for a glass of whiskey? And it's having those compelling arguments. It could be about rarity, age, and more expensive whiskey to produce. So you have to help them to do their job essentially in the on-trade. Once they go away with a whiskey, a particular brand of whiskey that they're able to recommend because they thought it tastes nice. Yeah. And it really comes down to that. Don't overcomplicate it. Just say, I did a whiskey training the other week and I tried this particular whiskey and I think you'll like it too. Give it a go.
But I think that's such a good point as well, is whenever they're recommending a whiskey, they're going to recommend the one that they liked from the training session. So much more genuine than just, here's the one that you have to sell. Here's the one that I actually like the most. And that's such an important part of the experience now, being in a bar or whatever it is people want recommendations. They might not necessarily have made their mind up before they even get to the bar. We have a few different props. So we've got a pint of malted barley, some bits of barrel staves. Are there any kind of props or tools or even techniques that you would use at a training session?
Well, I call that unprocessed whiskey. It's unprocessed whiskey.
Not whiskey yet.
I think things that are tangible, things you can smell, taste, touch, that really brings things to life for people. You talked about the last 10 minutes of a whiskey training. I think it's really helpful to have these tools here to demonstrate the component building blocks of essentially a bottle of whiskey. So as you said, whiskey is a really simple product. You have your grains, you have your yeast, which we can't see because it's a
but it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. You can have essentially your wood, and then the new make spirit that you have over here beside you, Joe, and then the aged spirit as well, so showing the effects of the different types of barrels. And they can clearly see like the influence of a sherry barrel, how dark something is, or the influence of a bourbon barrel. And you can see it's a bit lighter, but they have a distinct colour profile that you can make out. So even when they're pour out a glass of whiskey, they're able to see if something's darker, they might know, oh, maybe it's a European oak, or if it's American oak, it might be a bit lighter. So it gives them a clear indication of the building blocks of a bottle of whiskey. And I think when the monks, wherever they were on the island of Ireland somewhere, they didn't necessarily go out of their way to make whiskey, but it happened. Yeah. And then they would have left it in wooden barrels because they were the type of vessels that they stored
this is what you
sort of thing in. And then they figured out, oh, it actually tastes better the more I leave it in there. And really, by accident rather than by design, whiskey came about. But then refining the process, the influence of the technology that the Dutch brought into Ireland, in copper distillation, making the process more efficient. You have a world-beating product here where quality is not compromised, and every inch of the process is controlled, from where the trees come from, literally the forests, to state-of-the-art bottling processes as well. And I asked an Italian colleague, I said, what's the Italian for barrel? And they're like, Barillo. So I was like, oh, that's where barrel obviously comes from.
Yeah, he was right.
So basically aging in barrels, I suppose in Ireland, comes from the merchants, say here in Belfast, they would have imported wines and cognacs and sherries from all around Europe. And what would have happened is they would have decanted them into bottles and distributed them around to the hotels and bars around Ulster, and then you would have had empty barrels. So they would have brought them to the local distillery and filled them with new spirit.
Bonding as well is, like, a lot of people don't realise that was actually quite a recent thing too. Like up until the 1960s in Ireland, yes, a lot of liquid was being sold by the barrel in the bond.
Yeah, and the reason for that was because the way wholesalers or bonders, as we call them now today, but essentially the wholesale businesses in Ireland or publicans were supplied was by the barrel. Mm-hmm. And then they would have either decanted it in the bar themselves to people coming into the bar in a very traditional way, or else bottled it themselves with labels either supplied by the distillery or by labels they printed themselves, making reference to the distillery. But it was because that they were buying in all of these products like wine would have come in barrels. As I said, cognac, sherry, there was a whole plethora of drinks that we don't really even drink anymore that was coming in barrels. So the barrels didn't go back, they were transportation barrels. So they were reused in whiskey making. And as that died out in the 1950s, the supply of barrels coming in, the Irish whiskey industry basically had to go to the United States and sign a contract with the American whiskey producers to buy their empty barrels. And there's a wonderful picture of essentially all the greats of the Irish whiskey industry from north and south on top of the Pan Am building, which is the MetLife building in Manhattan, basically on their way to meet those whiskey producers to sign a contract with them.
Pretty important contract.
Pretty important.
Just when we're talking about bonding, I don't know if you know this, you might be aware, but actually just the bar that we're in right now is next door to the Dirty Onion.
Yes.
And the Dirty Onion would have been a bonded warehouse right up until 1991. If you look on the wall on the way out, you can see a big red N. It's very, very faint, but it's for north of Waring Street. So this would have been the bonded warehouse north of Waring Street. So there's still wee bits of that history dotted around the place. So we were talking about different fortified wines and different kind of wood influences.
Yes.
So we've got the likes of Method Madness, exploring different types of wood. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that is and what direction it might go in next.
Well, I think the wonderful thing about Irish whiskey is that we're able to experiment with basically wooden barrels. There are other types of whiskey produced in the world and they're restricted to oak barrels.
Yeah.
But Irish whiskey, by its nature, because historically we've used those transportation barrels, like wine would have come in chestnut barrels from France, or you would have had just different types of oak as well. We just went back into our archives, saw what type of barrels were being used. It is really interesting to try different types of wood like mulberry or cherry wood or Japanese cedar wood, and it opens up a whole new world. It's experimentation. You're bound to have things that don't work, but I think because of the over nearly 2.5 centuries of knowledge that's been imparted down to the people producing our whiskey, to our master distillers, people like Brendan Monks was probably would have learned a lot from his predecessor, and Kevin O'Gorman then subsequently, who was our head of maturation, is our head master distiller now. All of these people would have been a continuous line of people where all this knowledge would have been passed on.
For me, like I would be down at Middleton, down at the distillery, maybe a few times a year. And it always just still blows me away every time I go down there, just to see the scale and see the craft that goes into it. Is there any particular aspects of whiskey production that you find still just blow you away?
Distillation, the size of the stills, the shiny copper, maturation is like something from a Harry Potter book.
Yeah, that's where it gets a bit more magical.
But when it comes to distillation, it just absolutely amazes me. If you look at something like a Powers whiskey mirror, they always have that copper or gold. And it's obviously harken back to the stills. It's not there by mistake. It's there because of those magical stills.
It's because they are so beautiful and the people that make the whiskey appreciate them so much.
Yeah, very much so. It's just hard to believe how massive they are. That's historically because in Ireland, you would have found like the distilleries in Belfast were in Belfast. They were literally in the city. The distilleries in Dublin were in Dublin.
Yeah.
The distilleries in Cork were in the city centre. Whereas in, you look at other countries, we often talk about Scotland or even Wales, the distilleries tend to be quite rural and a little bit outside of towns and not on the same scale. So traditionally in Ireland, we've had a much bigger stills, and probably one of the reasons we tripled the still is in order to get into cask filling strength, we probably had to distill three times.
Distillation, yeah. I always think it's great if anyone ever visits Dublin and you're in the area. I always say take a walk into the National College of Art and Design and see the original pot stills from the Johns Lane distillery. Always just blows me away. Yeah,
they're in situ there, exposed to the elements. They've been essentially outside for now with the guts of 50 years. They stopped distilling there in August 1976, and we are in the process, hopefully, of helping to restore them. Which would be absolutely amazing. Like, get them polished up. They're, that blue kind of oxidation has essentially covered all of the copper. I think if they were polished up and lacquered, what an amazing sight they would be. And as you said, right in the centre of the city, if you're in Dublin, please go and visit them. An engineering department that made all of the parts to repair all of the motors and all of the belts, and it was a city within a city. It had a telephone system. So you could ring one part of the campus to the other in the late 19th century, which is just blows your mind. Like, I remember going to houses in the 80s and they didn't have phones, you know what I mean? So
they were ahead of their time.
Ahead of their time, yeah, really advanced.
When it comes to whiskey, especially premium whiskey, like we talk about being specific and like the right glass.
People who produce the whiskey, like our master distiller, master blender, they would insist on using appropriate glassware, so not plastic thimbles or, you know, anything. It's also very sustainable. You know, you can wash them afterwards and reuse them multiple times. So we use a wide base, and then it has a quite a long coned shape. The mouth is a little bit closed. That allows, even with your hand's body temperature, to allow evaporation of aromas and more volatile compounds to evaporate up into the glass, so you can appreciate the whiskey that's down there. And as we know, it must be by minimum 40% alcohol. So you don't want to agitate it too much, because if you do, you'll get a lot of alcohol coming up. So
it's not like wine where you really need to swirl it around.
No, you don't. And it is, as I said, just even at your room temperature, you're going to get a lot of evaporation out of the whiskey. So you just need to essentially agitate it slightly. And these sort of glasses are ideal. You could also use something like a sherry glass, or what's called a cupita, and that's also a really appropriate glass to do whiskey tasting with. But Joe, if you're at home, you drink out of whatever glass you feel comfortable drinking out of. You know, really, there's no rule that Irish whiskey must be consumed in a particular type of glass. If you like a whiskey tumbler, drink out of a whiskey tumbler. If you like a wine glass, some people like to drink out of a wine glass. There's nothing wrong with that either. Find a glass you feel comfortable with. This is only for whiskey tasting that I use a uniform glass across, I suppose, so everybody's experiencing the same thing, as opposed to if they're all in different glasses, people might experience the whiskey differently.
No, and I would agree. Like I tend to use very similar style glasses, like either these or the Copitas. And if I have a new whiskey and I'm really excited to taste it, generally that's the kind of glass I'll go for. But if it's like a Friday night or a Saturday night and I'm just having a glass of whiskey, generally I just pick the glass that I like the most. Yeah,
that's the way to do it. Irish whiskey is very versatile. You know, if you want to make a cocktail with it, if you want to elongate it with a bit of soda water, or even just add a few drops of water to open it up. But if you are coming to a whiskey for the first time, you've never tried it before, I'd recommend you taste it neat and nose it first. So lift it up, have a look at what's in the glass. Look how it behaves in the glass. If it's sticking to the sides, it's going to give an indication of what the mouthfeel is going to be like. You know, that it's going to have a nice viscosity in your mouth, a nice colour. People buy with their eyes. You know, you like the lovely golden, the liquid sunshine, as George Bernard Shaw called it, in the glass. And then have a little nose of it, and then taste it. So just appreciate it that way the first time. If you find it a bit overwhelming on your palate, just add a few drops of water. Something like this dropper here is brilliant. You know, you just add a few drops of water, opens it up, have another little taste. It'll soften off those alcohols as well. If you still find it a bit overwhelming, add a few more drops of water. Last resort, I would put in ice, because ice will numb down a lot of those flavours. And don't get me wrong, I love having a glass of something like a Black Barrel in the summertime with a bit of ice. But that's because I've tried it. Neat, and I know that's how I like it at that appropriate time.
Yeah, and it is just about trying as much as you can. I mean, for a lot of people out there, it'd say, "Oh, I don't like whiskey or I don't like Irish whiskey," and say, "Well, you might just not have found the right one yet."
Yeah, and unfortunately, I keep on finding whiskies that are more expensive.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I'll find one that, and I think I have found one which hopefully we'll be trying later. That is really accessible from a price point.
Well, I was just about to say, whenever you were doing your little demo there of the nosing and tasting, it looked very, very natural, but there was no whiskey in the glass. So no. I think we'll maybe change that. We'll head over to the bar and actually try one of these whiskies.
Yeah, I'd love that. Let's do it.
So we are now at the point of the day where we're actually going to taste some whiskey. So we've got a couple of new exciting whiskies for us to taste and talk about. And we're going to be starting with Jameson Single Pot Still. So Ger, can you just tell us a little bit about this whiskey?
So Jameson Single Pot Still is a revival of the style that's at the heart of Jameson, which is single pot still Irish whiskey. And the last time Jameson produced a pot still whiskey was in the late 1960s. So in 1968, Jameson, as we know it now today, was essentially born. Some people still call it Red Seal, Jameson Red Seal.
Where's Red Seal?
It had a red literally had a red seal. You see, this has a blue seal on the label, so literally that's what people call it. We have essentially brought back 100% single pot still Irish whiskey. The majority, or nearly all of the Jameson family, have been blends since the late 1960s. And a blend is when you mix pot still whiskey with another type of whiskey. And in our case, we mix it with grain whiskey. But in this, it's all made from barley, malted and unmalted, triple distilled, and then aged, really interestingly, in 5 different types of barrel. So you've first fill bourbon, first fill sherry, virgin European oak, virgin American oak, and also virgin Irish oak from Glenealy in County Wicklow.
Wow.
It doesn't go into any other product. It's specifically, we felled trees in that forest in Wicklow specifically for
this
Jameson
Jameson
single pot still.
So then even the fact that it's a single pot still is exciting and such a deviation from what we're used to, but also that combination of 5 different types of casks makes it fairly unique.
It does, and I think the exciting thing about it is, one, it's bringing back a style that has become more and more popular. It's what made you and me very much interested in it. We're both huge single pot still fans. This mash of malted and unmalted barley distilled in those big copper pot stills, and it's the style of pot still that's used in this particular whiskey is the style that's used in Jameson.
So it's Jameson at its core and its DNA.
Absolutely it is, and the 5 different cask types then add a huge amount of complexity. I think the price point is absolutely brilliant, so it's a really accessible from the price point of view as well. At the heart of Jameson, you have your first fill bourbon, so barrels that have been used to make American whiskey and then are used to make Irish whiskey, and your first fill sherry, your barrels that have been used to make, to be seasoned with Oloroso sherry, and then used to make Jameson whiskey. So they're in there, but then you have these 3 virgin oak barrels that have never been used before to make whiskey or haven't been seasoned with any other drink, and they add a lovely layer of complexity to it and give it extremely long length as well. So we might as well just jump in and grab a glass. It's 46% ABV, so alcohol by volume.
It's a very new whiskey.
It's a very new whiskey, but you'll notice on the labelling, it looks like it's been around forever.
Yeah.
You see this lovely kind of curve in the top of the label and then the straight lines at the bottom. If you looked at a bottle of historical Jameson, you'll see a lot of the similar shapes, from a visual point of view. And normally on a bottle of Jameson, you'll see 3 stars, but on this you'll see 5 stars.
Wow.
I suppose reflecting the 5 oak casks. But also Jameson produced a 5-star whiskey for the US market back in the day. People often ask why, and simply it was because the distributor was American, and they said, well, it's America, you've got to have 5 stars.
Yeah,
so it's kind of a historical thing that's on there, but also reflecting the 5 oak casks that are used as well.
I love the shade of blue. It's almost a bit like your blazer, actually.
It's often a bit like your shirt as well.
It was all deliberate.
Both dressed appropriately. Also, you see on the bottle, you'll see that the 5 oak casks are referred to in writing and listed out as well. So there's a lot of information on the label to tell you about this whiskey. And I think a criticism, which would have been fair in the past, would have been that whiskies like Jameson 1780, which are fantastic whiskies, but they wouldn't have told you much about what the whiskey was in the bottle. Whereas something nowadays, there's a huge amount of effort put in to tell you about what's in the bottle, but also to historically tell you about the whiskey as well.
Tells a bit of a story. I always say to people, especially if I'm doing training or tasting and people are wondering about a product and they have questions about it, always I'm more than happy to answer. But if you're ever in a bar and I'm not around, just have a look on the back of the bottle. We do put a lot of effort into putting as much information on there as we can. Well, we'll have a wee bit of a nose and a taste then. So for me on the nose, it definitely has some characteristics that I wouldn't have expected, from coming from those virgin oak casks, but also it still has that distinct Jameson fruit nose coming across.
Absolutely, you're getting almost like a hint of stewed kind of red apple. There's
Definitely
a real
apple.
caramel, this caramel sweetness that you're used to in Jameson as well. It's very much there, but there is layers of complexity and almost an earthiness there that you don't normally expect to find in Jameson, definitely coming from, I think, particularly the European and Irish oak.
For me, what I sometimes get from Irish oak is some of those darker kind of aromas like coffee or chocolate, and I would say a little bit of that definitely coming through there. Absolutely.
I think there's cocoa, coffee, those bitter kind of rich notes. I think there's a kind of a fudginess to it as well that is quite broad, not in your face, but it's really quite complex for a whiskey that's age range goes from 4 to 8 years old. Not overly aged, but is hopefully very delicious. Will we give it a go?
Cheers.
Cheers.
Very rich in mouthfeel, which obviously we would normally associate with a pot still whiskey, but lovely and creamy.
What immediately hits me is that there's a lovely sweet, that fudgy tanninness at the front of your palate, followed by pot still spices kicking in, that creaminess across the palate you were talking about. Again, lovely and sweet, and that kind of caramel sweetness transfers onto the palate. Then this complex, winding wood spiciness, which is still kind of traversing down my throat in a really pleasurable sort of way. And then all of a sudden, these kind of orchard fruits and forest fruits almost appear at the back of my palate.
It comes really in almost at the end.
Yeah.
Like you get this lovely little explosion of fruit right at the finish. I love that kind of red apple orchard fruit quality that you kind of find in some of the Jameson whiskies. And while it has that, it also has so much more due to those virgin oak casks as well. A fantastic whiskey, and obviously a fantastic new addition to the Jameson family.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's something that is only available in limited quantities. And it would be well worth getting your hands on a bottle. I know I've certainly already done that myself.
Well, you were good enough to bring this on up with us with you to taste.
As you can see, there's not much left in the bottle.
It's went down well.
Well, I've shared it with people as well. So I've shared it with my father, my brother, and a couple of friends as well. So I haven't drank it all myself, Joe. That's the great thing about whiskey is sharing. Back to where it all began. This Jameson single pot still. They never made malt whiskey. They never made grain whiskey until the 1970s, and now we're really getting back to where it all began.
Yeah, gone full circle.
Absolutely. Gotcha.
So, Ger, we've a little bit of a surprise for you. I know you're a man who appreciates his food, so just give me 1 second. Since we've got some lovely whiskey, we'd also bring some lovely cheese to try with it as well.
Amazing.
So we've got one, which is Young Buck, which is made in Newtonards. We've the Ballylisk here from Portadown, and then Temple Gall as well. So 3 different Irish cheeses. We would have previously used these before when we did some work with Powers whiskey. So we collaborated with different local artisan producers, chocolatiers, people who grow exotic plants, and then also people who make and sell cheese. So a friend of mine, Mike's Fancy Cheese, has a shop just around the corner where he sells all these lovely cheeses. So fantastic. Sometimes I get asked, quite often actually, whiskey and food. Yeah. Have you ever explored whiskey and food? And obviously there's a massive market for wine and food, and beer and food is becoming very common as well. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on between pairing whiskey with cheese or chocolate or anything like that. Have you tried it before?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is so creamy. There's a lovely little bit of saltiness, very subtly salty, but contrast very well with the sweetness of this, and the creaminess with the pot still probably work very well with it as well.
I think out of all the different foods, like cheese and whiskey is one that just naturally seems to be a bit of a connection to.
Cheese is a wonderful natural product. We all know where it comes from because literally you can see the cows in the field or goats on a hill, and where it comes from. And whiskey's the same. We know the provenance of this whiskey as well, and I think they're both absolutely amazing artisan products. And this cheese is absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
Anything that's probably high in protein, high in fat, or high in sugars tend to go very well with whiskey.
Yeah.
Because the whiskey will cut through it and probably have a lot of flavors that could be contrasting or could work really well with the particular product. So
I think whiskey is such a strong flavor that I think naturally cheese, which is obviously a very strong flavor as well, it's rich, it's salty, it can be creamy, it can be intense. So naturally, like a spirit like whiskey, which has equally complex flavors with a bit of sweetness and the alcohol, I think too, to cut through it is just the perfect sort of pairing.
That's a lovely surprise, Joe. I really think that's a brilliant thing you could do just in a small group, or even by yourself, buy some fancy
some
cheese.
Nice cheese and
off you go.
Yeah, I think it is. Whenever we do these kind of events, you're appealing to not just people who like whiskey, but there's also people who like just the food or like cheese or like the idea of pairing different drinks and foods together. So it'll be a combination of my knowledge from the whiskey side of things, but then also somebody from the kitchen, a chef or somebody who's experienced. So it was great for us to be able to work with Mike because, you know, we gave him the flavor profiles of our whiskeys and he thought, I know exactly what cheeses I think will work with those, and I think they did.
That's a brilliant way to go about it, just working with an artisan producer locally and then highlighting both artisan products, really. It's great.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, I think we're ready to taste our next whiskey. Okay, Ger, so we have a whiskey to taste here, a new release from Method Madness. This is a Method Madness oat and malt release. And this is a pretty exciting one. So this is the second whiskey from the micro distillery. That's
right. So the second release from the micro distillery in Middleton, it's a limited release of a mash bill of 60% oats and 40% malt, matured in ex-bourbon casks and bottled at 46% alcohol by volume as well. Both of us have been to the micro distillery in Middleton, which is a fully manual distillery that's operated by our distiller Eve O'Doherty and under the supervision of our distiller Catherine Condon as well. They do an amazing job of literally producing whiskey in a way that would have been, you know, similar to the way it was produced 100 years ago, literally by turning levers and using their senses, their sights, sight and smell and taste to decide when the cuts are going to be made. And, you know, the capacity of the distillery is about 10 barrels a week. Wow. So it's not a lot.
Not quite the same scale as the Garden Still House.
But I believe it's the 5th largest distillery in Ireland, which is
we call it a micro distillery,
yeah. But compared to the main distillery in Middleton, or the main plant as they call it, which would be filling up to 2,000 barrels or more than 2,000 barrels every day.
Wow.
It's a much smaller scale, but the same level of detail and attention is put in the micro distillery, but it gives us a space where we can experiment with new or old mash bills in this case, and try things that you just wouldn't be able to do in the main distillery because they're so busy producing amazing products like, you know, Redbreast and Middleton and Jameson and all those other whiskies. They just don't have the capacity to play around, and this gives us a chance to do it down there.
And I think you mentioned it there just about the old mash bills. I believe there was a bit of inspiration for some of these mash bills, found in an old recipe book.
That's right. You know, we're very lucky to have essentially a full-time professional archivist called Carol Quinn, and she's the custodian of the archives of the Jameson Distillery, the Powers Distillery, and the Cork Distilleries companies, and other distilleries as well that eventually became absorbed into those distilleries. And, you know, literally, if you're looking for inspiration on where to innovate, you just really need to look back and see what we did before. And they have experimented with every kind of mash bill you can imagine. You know, double distilled malt, triple distilled malt, you know, every kind of non-GI and anything you can think of, they've tried in the micro distillery in Middleton. Well, we have a little taste and see what it's like.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this one because I know oats are something that historically would have occasionally popped up in Irish distilleries and brands, but it's a bit of a new venture for us, at least recently.
Absolutely, and I suppose, you know, in the times of, in the past, oats would have been specifically very common because they were consumed by an animal that was working in the distillery at the time. They would have been horses right up to the 1970s, and in Jameson they had horses working there. They had small little ponies carrying bags of grain in the warehouse, and then they had draft horses who used to draw the barrels around the city, and it would have been a common animal. So oats would have been readily available, and also they were used as almost like a natural mash filter in louter tuns as well. So it meant that they would have been able to used as a filter bed as part of the production. They would have been there in the past, definitely, but as technology allowed and we used, you know, more modern mash filters and things like that, we didn't need to use them in our mash bill anymore. Sláinte. What often excites me about the Method of Madness range of whiskies is that you are always surprised about how different they are. You almost have to reposition yourself mentally about what you're tasting because you have all the reference points in pot still whiskey that you're used to articulating. And when it comes to this, you really are. It's brilliant. It's exciting. It means you really have to work, not too hard, but you have to work a little bit harder.
Keeps you on your toes a little bit more.
Keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. It's a beautiful nose. Like, for me, it's very much that kind of sweet shop sort of character.
I was going to say it's kind of like sweet chili, and there's a little bit of cream soda type note to it as well.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
I definitely see what you mean about the cream soda.
There's a broad fruitiness in it that you get when you go into like pear drops or something when you go into a sweet shop.
Boiled sweets, which is funny. Like sometimes in our whiskies, those are the kind of flavour notes that I find. Things like foam bananas, boiled sweets, pear drops, those kind of things. Definitely some of that. There's some lovely fleshy fruit in there as well. I know what you mean maybe about the chili. It's something a bit herbal, but very unlike, not only any of the whiskies from our portfolio, but also any of the other Method Madness. It's quite different.
Yeah, it's really evocative when you mention the fleshy fruit there. It's almost like, it's kind of like your boiled pears or something like that. Gorgeous.
Well, I'm gonna have a wee taste.
Sludge. Yeah, and again, the mouthfeel is very different than we'd be used to as well. It has a lovely kind of broad creaminess across the palate.
It's a different type of creaminess though, than what I'm used to in a pot still.
It is. It's kind of like not that dairy creaminess that you get in a pot still. It's more of a kind of a light oiliness across the palate.
Oily, yeah.
Like a really fine olive oil, that sort of...
Yeah, whereas pot still I associate more with that like buttery creaminess, almost like dairy. But a lovely palate as well. Like a nice, like quite delicate, quite floral, quite juicy.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a hint of citrus oil in it.
I think just overall another exciting release and something quite different from the distillery.
Really different and, again, very limited as well. So, I suppose to say once it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah.
That's sort of cliche, but definitely. And again, the packaging is just absolutely beautiful and it's just really unique and also reflects what's in the glass as well.
I love the attention to detail with the kind of lovely straight lines on one side and then your more kind of evocative madness on the other. And then similarly on the sides of the bottle, like the attention to detail is just beautiful. Yeah,
it's lovely in the hand. It's lovely. It also on the shelf, it looks great.
It does
as well.
It catches your eye, I think.
Definitely.
So we have a couple more questions I just wanted to ask you, Ger. First one, I guess, would be if you were to give any advice to somebody who wanted to get into Irish whiskey, where was a good place to start, or what would you suggest that they do?
I wouldn't be too overly concerned about what area that you get into. I would just try and get your foot in the door. Working in a pub is a really great place to work to build up your knowledge, or there's a number of specialist whiskey shops that have opened up around, all over Northern Ireland that are really great to work in as well.
And then for somebody that maybe just wants to explore it and to taste some nice Irish whiskey, so say somebody drinks bourbon or Scotch whiskey, where's a good place to start?
Don't drink bourbon, don't drink Scotch whiskey. No, I'm only joking. You should really, I think there's a great opportunity to become a member of a local club that may be associated with your pub, or Whiskey Club NI is also a wonderful place to learn more about Irish whiskey. And certainly if you see someone like yourself, Joe, who's doing a whiskey tasting, anywhere in Northern Ireland, try and get along to one of your whiskey tastings. I would definitely recommend that. Other things I'd recommend would be going into your specialist off license or your specialist bottle shop, or into your local bar, and trying to find a place that has a really good selection of whiskey behind the bar, and just ask them more about it.
Yeah.
And you can learn a lot from just chatting to someone who's passionate about Irish whiskey.
And clearly you have that passion as well. And 21 years now you've been working in the trade. I just have to ask as well, would you have any advice you might give to a younger Ger Garland?
Sit down and listen more to the people that you took for granted that you worked with. I'm finding now that people are speaking historically about people that I knew and that I worked with as if they were historical figures in our archives. So I would definitely say, I think if even I could, whether it's your own grandparents or your own parents, try and sit down with your smartphone, press record, and let them tell you more about their experiences of going places and experiencing things that really don't exist anymore, trades that don't exist anymore. You know, my grandfather was a horseman. He was a whiskey drinker as well. My first experiences of whiskey are seeing him having a glass of whiskey after, you know, on a special occasion at Christmas, or bringing me home from school as well. So you'd have these experiences, and I often now wish that I had talked to him more about his life working with horses and things like that. That really is a very specialist area now, whereas the whiskey was very much part of his life as well.
Well, listen here to your grandfather then.
Oh,
Well, Ger, it's been an absolute pleasure having you
My
up.
pleasure.
We could have kept you here all night, I'm sure. Could have made a bit of a night out in the town of it. But really appreciate you taking the time to come up and see us. So thank you so much.
thank you. My pleasure. Cheers, Joe.
Okay, so thanks for tuning in, guys. For more whiskey knowledge and to learn more about different local whiskey events, local bars and retailers, just please visit our Whiskey Club website.